I'm Scott Sowell from Amvest Capital, coming to you today live from New York City. We're thrilled to have you with us today for today's webinar, Harnessing Critical Minerals, Innovation for Deterrence, brought to you by our team at Amvest Terraden. A special thanks to our partners at Cohera for making this webcast possible. Before we dive in, a quick disclaimer: this webinar is for informational purposes only and does not constitute an offer to sell or the solicitation of an offer to sell or buy any security and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. Now, let me introduce you to Amvest Terraden, the driving force behind today's webinar. Our focus is on companies that explore, develop, and extract critical minerals. These minerals are not just resources, they're the building blocks of technologies that are shaping our future. From transportation to energy generation and storage, these technologies span sectors. What sets Terraden apart is our unwavering commitment to ESG compliance. We exclusively support companies operating within the Western value chain, ensuring they are not tied to Chinese or Russian interests. This approach aligns with our dedication to sustainability and responsible resourcing. And as you'll learn in today's webcast, defense and security are also significantly impacted by these critical minerals. Joining me today are my esteemed colleagues, Stuart Macliver and Tomasz Nadrowski, co-founders of Amvest Terraden. Their extensive knowledge and experience in the field of critical minerals and sustainability make them the perfect guides for today's discussion. Stuart is not only co-founder of Amvest Terraden, but also the managing director of Amvest Capital, and founder. Based here in New York, Stuart combines his finance and geology expertise to evaluate natural resource opportunities from both the technical and financial perspectives. With extensive experience in corporate advisory and transactions, Stuart has worked across M&A, equity, and debt capital markets in the natural resources sector. He holds a Bachelor of Commerce from the University of Western Australia, is a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Australia, and has a graduate diploma in geology from the Western Australian School of Mines. We're also joined today by Tomasz Nadrowski, our portfolio manager and co-founder of the Amvest Terraden Fund. Tomasz is a seasoned expert in mining investments with over 25 years of global experience. His career includes roles as portfolio manager, commodity strategist, and commodity analyst at various firms across North America, London, the Netherlands, and Johannesburg. Tomasz is a former director of the World Economic Forum, holds a CFA charter, and is fluent in a very impressive 7 languages. He earned advanced degrees from the School of Economics and Social Sciences and the University of Geneva. In our rapidly evolving world, critical minerals have emerged as indispensable resources that transcend the realm of electric vehicles and green technologies. The pivotal elements play a fundamental role in shaping global defense, security, and geopolitical stability, profoundly impacting the trajectory of industries and nations alike. Today, we're going to embark on an insightful exploration of this multifaceted implications of strategic metals. We'll uncover how they catalyze technological innovation and fortify global defense capabilities, examine the risks inherent in relying on overseas sources, and unravel the opportunities that lie ahead. Moreover, we'll delve into the crucial role that critical minerals play in both public and private entities and how they must embrace this to secure and safeguard critical mineral supply chains. To underscore the gravity of this topic, let's reflect on the words of President Dwight D. Eisenhower from 1963. When we became involved in World War II, our lack of adequate stockpile of strategic and critical materials gravely impeded our military operations, but we had not fully learned our lesson. After we became involved in hostilities in Korea, we went through experiences almost identical with those of World War II. Those words, as resonant today as they were 61 years ago, underscore the ongoing urgency and significance of our discussion. The strategic importance of critical minerals is paramount as they underpin both technological progress and national security. This morning's news about Russia launching a satellite likely capable of attacking other satellites in low Earth orbit further illustrates the critical and timely nature of our discourse. I firmly believe that you'll find, as I have, this is an enlightening, challenging, and exceedingly necessary conversation that we must engage in order to secure a prosperous future for all. After the formal presentation, we'll open the floor for questions, and so please submit them and we'll ask them in real time. And so, without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Tomasz, who will guide us through today's discussion.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, President Eisenhower, and thank you, everybody else, for joining us today. So we're going to talk about critical minerals. I hope you see the slides. Usually, any discussion about critical minerals tends to kind of gravitate towards energy transition metals. But energy transition is only part of the transformational story. And so today we'll focus on this other source of demand, usually or very often dismissed as a sort of, oh, it's defense applications. Well, it's understandable that it's dismissed because this sector has been dormant for over 3 decades now, certainly since the so-called Last Supper, an event that occurred back in 1993 that led to or accelerated consolidation in what the extreme left and extreme right in this country refer to as industrial military complex. From about 50 companies in this sector in the late 80s, we ended up with 5. And so the result is that for over a generation, investors didn't really have to bother about this sector. However, it's our view that in the current geopolitical context, it's pretty obvious that we need equipment, robust equipment, and a lot of this. This is not to wage a war, but rather to prevent it from happening. And the key term here is deterrence. So those who are interested in strategy, there are 2 types of deterrence. There's a deterrence by denial and deterrence by punishment. And probably for too long, we have relied on deterrence by punishment, which consisted in issuing threats, right? Threats of sanctions, for example. If your government does X, then we'll cut you off from, say, semiconductor technology or a swift global messaging, financial messaging system, or maybe from the flows of seaborne fossil fuel shipments. Except that it doesn't really work. I mean, the punishment has been rather patchy at best. It didn't stop Russia from invading Ukraine, and the regimes in Tehran and Pyongyang have remained viable threats despite decades of sanctions and threats of more sanctions. And Moscow, too, has been able to conduct robust trade in the last 2 years, swift or not swift. So if you just look at the budgets, our adversaries' budgets have exploded in the last 15, 20 years, while our military budget, defense budget, has more or less stagnated. So what we end up with instead is deterrence by denial. So not punishing others for what we define as their misbehavior, but rather not allowing them to misbehave in the first place. And that's why we need modern equipment, both in quantity and in quality, and that equipment will need a lot of critical minerals. Now, critical minerals can only be sourced from 2 sources, either from recycling or from mining, and today I'll focus on mining. And unfortunately, in mining, the United States is not particularly competitive. Just look at the permitting timelines. In such powerful countries as the United States or Burkina Faso, it takes about a decade to permit a mining project. In our ally countries, such as Canada and Australia, about a third of that. And these timelines impact NPVs, especially in high interest rate environment. If you add to it a leftist anti-mining bent and Wall Street's complete lack of interest in this sector, the result is that the industry is now, in our countries, over-dependent on inflows of critical minerals from remote destinations. Not only remote, but also sometimes hostile. And the US is particularly vulnerable because having successfully strangled its mining industry, we are reliant on imports of a number of commodities. Here's a map from the US Geological Survey that shows that the country that is the leading source of America's mineral commodities is China for 24 minerals, followed by Canada with 23. Now, this is particularly troubling whenever there are few alternatives, that is for those minerals which are highly concentrated geographically or geologically, if you wish. And Congressional Research Service found that for 53 critical minerals on the US list of critical minerals, 37 have supply chains that are dominated by just one single dominating country. Now, as you will see here on the next slide, on the demand side, we all tend to kind of compete for more or less the same minerals. And it's a problem if any of these minerals, if the supply of any of these minerals is weaponized, as already happened in Chinese case last year with germanium, gallium, and graphite. But it's not only China. A recent research by OECD showed that over 13,000 restrictions have been added in the last 10 years by commodity producing countries. And it's a five-fold increase compared to the previous decades. And we often despair about our inability to manufacture certain products, but this OECD report makes a point that external dependency on key raw materials is actually much, much worse. The top 6 countries here that mostly constrain flows of materials are China, followed by India, Argentina, Russia, Vietnam, and Kazakhstan. And just in case if you think that this is just an American problem, here's a picture of Europe. Europeans face exactly the same issues of overdependence on Chinese supplies and also on other countries. So what I propose today is that we review the needs of our armed forces, categorized per military domain, and then find out which are the minerals that really matter of critical importance for the main military applications. And not only what they are, but also where they are, they can be found from perspective of natural endowment and the prevailing types of deposits. And I hope you'll realize just how monumental the task ahead is if we are to erect proper deterrence and avoid a hegemonic war against our strategic rivals. So let's start with the Air Force. Now, if we're talking the Air Force, one of the key tasks in the Air Force is reconnaissance and navigation. And a mineral that's critical for these applications is beryllium, used a lot in aerospace in alloys with copper and nickel. It's a key component for real-time imagery equipment, which is used for targeting, search, detection, navigation, and surveillance system. It ends up in many fighter jets, but predominantly in UAVs, unmanned aerial systems, especially those used for reconnaissance flights. Now, where do we find beryllium? Well, there are basically 3 types of deposits. There are carbonatite deposits that you find in southern Greenland or in Utah in the United States, peralkaline deposits in Mexico or Texas, and felsic pegmatites, which you find in China, Russia, parts of Africa. So you'll notice one thing is that thanks to one producing mine in Utah, the U.S. is actually pretty well endowed domestically with this material. That mine is operated by a company called Materion Natural Resources. And so beryllium doesn't really present a supply risk for our armed forces, and you will see this is something of an exception. If you were to look for other value chains that are dominated upstream by the US mining industry, you probably have to go all the way to high purity quartz. And we're not going to talk about it today, although it's critical for the production of, for example, Taiwanese high-end semiconductors. But let's stick to the Air Force and its needs. Jet engines. Well, for jet engines, you need 3 types of minerals: niobium, vanadium, and rhenium. Niobium used in superalloys with nickel, cobalt, iron, and in gas turbines. And where do we find niobium? Well, 3 types of deposits again. There are carbonatite, rare earth iron phosphate deposits, such as in Kola Peninsula in northern Russia, Transvaal in South Africa, or the infamous Mountain Pass mine in California. Much richer source of niobium is from primary and secondary carbonatite deposits with tantalum, not least in Brazil, a mine called Araxá, with supergene enrichment in Minas Gerais, another complex in Catalão, in Goiás. There's also one deposit in Quebec, and a new one being developed in Western Australia called West Arunta. The company, Australian company that's developing this, has seen its share price behave more like a Veblenyan good. The higher it is, the more people are buying it. And then the third type of deposits is peralkaline deposits, as on Kola Peninsula, Greenland, Saudi Arabia, and also one deposit in New South Wales in Australia that has recently attracted support from the Australian and the US government as well. But this map may be misleading because, in fact, just one mine, Araxá mine in Minas Gerais, supplies about 77% of the world's niobium. This is shown here with this arrow pointing to a dominant source of global supply, and we have put these arrows to sort of facilitate your reading of these maps going forward for each mineral. This concentration is very unhelpful for the development of technologies using niobium because of course, national security concerns. And you can say, well, Brazil, who cares, right? Well, Brazil has recently refused to sell its ammo to the European Union for the use in Ukraine. Next one, which matters for us here in jet engines, is vanadium. Well, vanadium, it's used in alloys with titanium and aluminum in jet engines and high-speed aircraft. Most of this, however, is sourced not from mining, but obtained as a byproduct of steel smelter slag, for example, in China or in Russia. When it is mined, it mostly comes from deposits marked here as VTM, which are titanium magnetite deposits in South Africa, in Bahia in Brazil, Damiao mine in Inner Mongolia, as well as one in Ural and in Sichuan in China. There's also a project in southern Queensland now in Australia that's looking at soft oxides, but it's going to be problematic to extract it without the associated calcium there. Now, a more exotic, less well-known mineral that also is important for jet engines is rhenium. It's one of the rarer elements on Earth's crust, although it doesn't count as rare earth. We'll talk about it a bit later. It was identified on the island of Etorofu, which is one of those Japanese islands still occupied by Russia since the Second World War. It has the third highest melting point of all minerals. It's usually alloyed with molybdenum and tungsten in, say, F-22 Raptors, F-35 stealth fighters, and it's geologically can be obtained as a byproduct of a molybdenum mined with copper. The main source is Chilean copper mines, but it can be found in Montana as well, in Idaho, in Poland, as well as Hubei in China. There are other countries that have it geologically, but do not necessarily know how to extract it. Sticking to the Air Force, let's talk about hypersonics. And if we talk about hypersonics, we have to mention titanium. Now, titanium, for those who are old enough, may remember it was one of the key materials of the first Cold War, used in high-temperature superalloys with vanadium and aluminum in turbines in hypersonic missiles as a hypersonic thermal protection. In its structural components for satellites as well, and you also find it on a lot of old Soviet monuments celebrating the space race. The monuments to Sputnik or to Yuri Gagarin. If you go to Moscow next weekend, you can enjoy those. Titanium, where do we find it? Well, we can find it mostly in oxides, oxides called rutile, about 60% titanium, or with iron oxides called ilmenite, 32% titanium, predominantly in alluvial and fluvial deposits in Southeastern Africa, Southwest Pacific, Southeast Asia. Probably if you want to do mining, that's the nicest mining you can do outside of a cyclone season, because you basically work on a beach or very close to the beach. Personal experience, very recommended in, say, Mozambique. The second source would be titanium magnetite deposits, a VTM that we have seen already with vanadium, and so they're very unusually mined for titanium. If they're mined at all, it's for vanadium. Moving to the next branch of the armed forces, the Army. By this I mean the land service of the armed forces, and straight to tank armor. Tank armor needs a lot of boron. Boron is a metalloid with some properties of both metals and non-metals, and can be transformed to extremely hard yellow crystals. What's usually used is carbon borate, so it's a ceramic, also used in bulletproof vests. In nature, it appears in various forms, often mined as from evaporitic borate deposits. And a little bit like in the case of niobium, you'll find that there's one mine that's very, very dominant. It's in Turkey, a mine called Kırka in Eskişehir province in northwest Turkey. That's home to 73% of identified global boron reserves, although it technically could be also extracted from some of those evaporitic lithium boron deposits in the Andean region or in southwestern Tibet. It's also possible to mine it from lithium boron sedimentary deposits such as Jadar Valley in Serbia and Rhyolite Ridge in Nevada, which is currently in permitting. Also, you find boron in geothermal brines, in beautiful places such as New Zealand or Iceland. To my knowledge, none of these are used for mining right now. Sticking to our army, body armor and night vision. And we're discussing here the first of the rare earth oxides, lanthanum. Lanthanum, it's important not only for body armor, but also it's used for infrared absorbing glass and night vision goggles. And with europium, another rare earth, it's used in plasma displays. But because it's a rare earth, we'll discuss them all geologically later, because all 17 of them occur together. So we'll come back to maps a little later. But the other metal, major metal that's used for body armor, because it resists not only corrosion, but also impact, as you may probably not have heard, is nickel. In body armor, it's combined with chromium and molybdenum. And nickel, well, nickel appears in 3 different forms. One of these forms, awaruite, is fairly recent, only 3 places that we know of, and Sumitomo is supporting a future mine in British Columbia that's associated with iron oxide. But typically, it appears either as sulfide or as laterite. Different types of sulfides, layered basin deposits such as Sudbury in Ontario, flood basalts like in northern Russia or Gansu in China, Jinchuan mine. There are other sulfidic mafic deposits concentrated in near regions of localized intrusions like Voisey's Bays in Newfoundland, for example. There are komatitic deposits, so ultramafic sulfide volcanics in Australia with a little higher grade, in Canada with a lower grade, and then there are also the nickel cobalt 5 epithermal veins, which, however, if they are mined at all, they are mined for cobalt rather than nickel. And then those laterites, those brownish points here on the map, these are tropical sedimentary laterites, results of dissolution of minerals in the oxidation zone, and their redeposition at deeper zone. You find it all around those lower latitudes, Southwest Pacific, Southeast Asia, northern part of South America, Madagascar, and Caribbean. Moving to the next application, electric batteries. Now, why are we talking about electric batteries in defense applications? Well, because they're important for electric powered tactical vehicles, autonomous systems, and of course, drones. And 3 different minerals that matter here: graphite, lithium, and manganese. Graphite, of course, is used in anodes of lithium-ion batteries, but it's also used in fuel cells, jumbo flakes, so the large flakes of graphite below 50 mesh. You'll find them in fuel cells in unmanned aerial vehicles, in military aircraft, and satellites, and in ground support equipment. Where do we find graphite? Well, graphite is found disseminated as flakes in contact metamorphic rocks, so it's always a result of metamorphism of carbonaceous sedimentary rocks, such as, say, black shales. A lot of this in northern China, in Inner Mongolia and Heilongjiang, central Kazakhstan, Quebec, Tanzania, Mozambique, Pakistan, Bahia in Brazil. But it can also come from metamorphosed oil, as in Sri Lanka, quite unique deposits there, or even as so-called amorphous graphite, lower grade, the least graphitic of them all, and that's its genesis is the metamorphosis of anthracite, so coal, as in Korea and Hunan in China or in Austria. There's also a very different deposits in northern Sweden, result of mass oxygenation period that killed cyanobacteria some 2 billion years ago. Moving to lithium, and of course, lithium in liquid electrolyte of lithium-ion batteries. It doesn't really appear in metallic elemental form in the concentrations geologically, but it's more as ionic mineral in aqueous environments, both subsurface brines and consolidated hard rock deposits. In those hard rock deposits, it either appears as spodumene, so lithium aluminum silicate that occurs in dikes of granitic pegmatite. For example, all over Western Australia, as you can see here, Minas Gerais in Brazil, and Western Central Africa, Quebec, But it also appears as lepidolite, hard rock lepidolite, lower grade all around Africa in Jiangxi province in China, as jadarite in Serbia, or sometimes as condensed clay deposits, as in Kings Valley in Nevada or in Sonora in Mexico. On the other hand, those subsurface brines, a significant source of lithium carbonate production, are either continental, so salt pans and salars, which are evaporitic deposits in the Andean region in southwest Tibet or southwest Afghanistan as well. But there are also other types, geothermal brines that require direct lithium extraction, of which there are 3 different technologies. They're usually lower grade. You find them in Alberta, Canada, Upper Rhine Valley, or in Southern California. And also oil field-based deposits, which are basically enriched solutions removed as waste product from active oil fields. Smackover trend in southern Arkansas and Louisiana is an example of those, but also there are plans in Saudi Arabia and UAE to extract that type of lithium. And manganese. Manganese is in cathodes of lithium-ion deposits. This map again is somewhat misleading, because despite this apparent ubiquity, the top 5 mines are responsible for 45% of total production, of which the most important 3 mines are in South Africa in the Kalahari region. This is the Banded Iron Ore Formation, manganese. Similar deposits can be found also in parts of Gabon, Brazil, or Wafangze mine in Inner Mongolia of China. The second only type of manganese, which is really high grade, is the supergene enriched manganese. So may have different origins, sedimentary or metamorphic hydrothermal deposits. Gruta Eland mine in Northern Territory in Australia is a good example here. Badly damaged this year by cyclone, hence the prices of manganese have picked up quite a bit. But also Moanda mine in Gabon, deposits in Amapá in Brazil, and other places in Western Africa. And you have those other mentioned here on the map, but they are of economically less importance economically. Next branch, the Space Force, a relatively young branch of our armed forces. And here we need 3 types of minerals: praseodymium, which is a rare earth, germanium, and platinum. Praseodymium is very heat tolerant, so it's used in thermal resistant alloys and many satellite components, often alloyed with magnesium. Since it's a rare earth, we come back to its distribution a little later. Germanium, on the other hand, it's a semiconductor, a little similar in its aspect to silver, because highly reflective, and it's used in wafers, used in solar power panels, which function as power plants for U.S. Space Force and for satellites. Now, where do we find germanium? Essentially, it can be mined from germanium-bearing coal seams, as for example in the most important mine in the world, Linsang mine in Yunnan in China. A similar deposit is located in Bulgaria. But usually, germanium is actually never mined directly outside of those examples, but it's a byproduct of zinc processing from different types of zinc deposits, either mesothermal zinc, lead, silver polymetallic veins, as for example, Morococha in Peru or Kino Hill in Yukon or in Idaho, or as a byproduct from polymetallic high sulfidation epithermal veins, as in Bolivia, Colorado, or Germany. Next, platinum, of course, a very rare element, highly prized, but relatively well known. This is used in rocket engines and other space technologies to make aircraft turbine blades, as well as coatings, engine seals, and gaskets. We find it mostly in thin layers of sulfide ores within mafic environments. For example, in South Africa, it's in layered mafic intrusions of a reef type. Those reefs can run like Marinsky Reef for about 80 kilometers underground. Smaller deposits of this type are known in Zimbabwe, the Great Dyke, or Stillwater in Montana. And there are some other sources of platinum, not least the primary magmatic deposits with nickel and copper is in northern Russia, in Timur Peninsula, for example, or in Finland. There are chromite deposits, hydrothermal deposits, or fluvial and alluvial deposits, for example, in Far East Russia, but they're of lesser economic importance. Next military branch, the Navy. Now, the Navy among other things, needs sonar transducers. What are sonar transducers? For those who don't know, they emit acoustic signals or pulses into water and then capture the echo rebounding from different objects. Lutetium is a rare earth oxide that's important for that, used for amplification and enhanced resolution of those signals. Not only in sonar transducers, but also in detection of gamma radiation and chemical detection and in radars. Which brings us closer to electronic warfare in general. That refers to a range of equipment that includes electronic jamming devices. An important mineral here is yttrium. Yttrium is used in advanced targeting systems, for example, in F-35 stealth fighters. It offers density amplification and capacitance. Capacitance meaning capacity to store electric charge, very important for jamming. Again, rare earth, so we come back to this a little later. And now we're going to talk about different lethal applications across all branches, starting with precision-guided missiles. They need two minerals, samarium and cobalt, together. They actually formed permanent magnets that withstand high temperatures, so used in precision guiding missiles and smart bombs. Samarium is a rare earth, so again, we come back to this later. Cobalt, on the other hand, can be found in a variety of contexts, but it's hardly ever mined for cobalt. It's usually a byproduct of either copper or nickel. When it is mined separately, it's from those 5-element epithermal veins, such as in Morocco, the Boazer mine. Similar deposits can be found also in Western Kazakhstan and in High Altai in Russia. But the main source are copper mines in the southern Congo, the sediment-hosted stratiform copper deposits, and also in Zambia, as well as a lot of production coming now from nickel. So historically, it would come from nickel copper sulfide veins, such as those in Finland, northern Russia, or potentially New South Wales in Australia. However, recently, most growth we've seen from the nickel-bearing laterite deposits with supergene enrichment, not least on Weda Bay and Halmahera Island in Indonesia. You can find also cobalt in iron oxide copper gold deposits in Sweden, Northwest Territories of Canada, or Atacama region in northern Chile. All right, moving to munitions. We'll need here 4 different minerals: tantalum, antimony, scandium, and tungsten. Tantalum used in explosively formed projectiles and warheads and missile systems. Where do we find it? We find it in 3 different types of deposits. One is peralkaline deposits, as in Greenland, Northwest Territories, Saudi Arabia. Enriched granite, a lot of those are in Egypt and in Chita region of Russia, and enriched pegmatite all over Western Australia. In fact, a lot of hard rock lithium mines that are extracted for lithium today historically used to be tantalum mines. You also find them in Minas Gerais in Brazil and in Africa, where it's often referred to as coltan. You might have heard of coltan. It's columbite tantalite in granitic pegmatites, especially in the DRC, in Rwanda, but also in Nigeria, and they're also deposited in Fujian in China. The second one in this section, antimony used in pressure blasting applications, rarely occurs as a native element, with the exception of sediment-hosted hydrothermal replacement deposits, metamorphic replacement deposit. What's replaced? Well, usually limestone. And the largest mine in Hunan in China, called Langshuijiang, is the largest mine, antimony mine, specifically mined for that, although you find similar deposits also in Iran. It also appears in carbonate-hosted deposits, such in Hubei in China or in Tajikistan or in Mexico. And very interestingly, for those who invested in gold in the past, there are also gold antimony quartz deposits in gold shear zones, a bane of gold producers historically. Why? Because antimony minerals tend to encapsulate gold and also consume a lot of cyanide or an oxide during the processing of this. So those who historically invested in Carlin Trend, for example, or in Guangxi deposits in China, in Youjiang, know how painful it was to process these gold ores. But it is possible to mine those for antimony, for example, in Natal of South Africa or in Quebec. Scandium is another important mineral here, important for development of high-strength materials for munitions because they contribute to precision and efficiency of explosive devices. Scandium is usually actually recovered from various process streams. So Rio Tinto processes titanium oxide production in Quebec and obtains some scandium there as a byproduct. Sumitomo in the Philippines has a nickel refinery also to obtain scandium. Russians use red mud from bauxite processing. In Ukraine before the war, Zoltaya Voda was iron ore processing also with scandium byproduct. But if you do mine it, then you usually mine it from magmatic carbonitic deposits, such as those in Inner Mongolia in China by an obo mine. Monte Alto in Bahia in Brazil could in future become a source of scandium, as well as two different projects in northern Quebec and Kiviniemi, a mine in Finland. But also there are laterite deposits in New South Wales and Western Australia and New Caledonia and Turkey. Tungsten is usually used for armor penetrating projectiles. That was known throughout 20th century for military applications, has the highest melting temperature of all elements other than carbon. It's also one of the heaviest elements. You'll find three types of deposits. All of them are results of felsic plutonism historically. One is granite-hosted tin tungsten deposits, as we find in Bolivia, in Alaska, in Tasmania, in the DRC, and also on that region that straddles Yunnan in China with Myanmar, Burma. There are also porphyries, either with tungsten, with tin, or with molybdenum. The main mine of this source is Wunying in Jiangxi, northern Jiangxi in China. It's actually the world's largest porphyry belt, Jiangnan belt in China. But you also find them in Indonesia, in Vietnam, which is the largest mine outside of China, in Austria. And finally, skarns. Again, a lot of consolidation in Asia. You find skarns in China. People call China the Saudi Arabia of rare earths, but it's also Saudi Arabia of tungsten. And also in both Koreas. It's a very promising mine in South Korea, which was already exploited during the Japanese period there. And also North Korea's largest source of foreign exchange before Ukrainian war was tungsten from a mine there called Manyon. And you find it also skarn, which is metamorphic alteration of limestones. You find it in Turkey, you find it in Northern Caucasus, on the border between Yukon and Northwest Territories, and there's also one promising project in Nevada. Okay, so now we're going to speak only about rare earths to just close this section. Not all of rare earths, but these are just those that we have mentioned already or will mention, and we'll mention some of them in the context of lasers and photonic disruptors. And if we talk lasers, holmium is one mineral which is really important. It's actually the element with the strongest magnetic moment, so it generates artificially strong magnetic fields for solid-state lasers, so lasers that use a solid medium to emit photons, not a gas or liquid. And another one is europium. Europium is used for laser targeting and photonic disruptors, often in combination with yttrium and terbium, which are other rare earth oxides. In missile guidance and control systems, we have three different minerals: dysprosium, terbium, and neodymium. You're probably more familiar with those because usually when we analyze a rare earth deposit, we look at those three plus maybe praseodymium. Now, dysprosium is present in cruise missiles, in smart bombs, in fin actuators, in joint direct attack munitions, which convert dumb bombs into smart guided precision guided munitions. It's also in unmanned aircraft. You find it in surface-to-air missiles, in anti-ship missiles, and bunker busters, and so on. Its sister material, terbium, it's also present in advanced targeting systems for F-35s, in laser-equipped computer gun sights, in Abrams tanks, and in Raytheon rangefinders. And finally, neodymium, which is not heavy rare earth, unlike the other two. It's more used as a category magnet rare earth because of its role in permanent magnets. Here is used in guidance systems, for example, for F-35s, for Tomahawk cruise missiles, in the U.S. Navy for Columbia-class submarines in future, and Virginia-class submarines currently. It's also in joint direct attack munition systems and Predator unmanned aerial systems, and also in guided missile destroyers of the US Navy. And finally, we have air defense systems. Gadolinium and other rare earth, really important here, used to prevent collisions for surveillance and navigation purposes. You'll find it in Patriot missile air defense systems, where it employs radio frequency circulators. It magnetically controls the flow of electronic signals in missiles and in radar. It's also applied in sonar applications that we have seen before. So where do we find all of these rare earths that we talk about so often? Well, first and foremost in carbonatite hosted deposits, the largest mine being Bayan Obo in Inner Mongolia of China. It's also found in Shandong and Sichuan in China, in Helmand province in Afghanistan, Mount Weld in Western Australia, the most important mine of the sort of on the western side of the market divide, but also there are other projects now developed in Tanzania, in Brazil, and potentially in Republic of Mongolia. The second type of deposit are peralkaline deposits. We've seen some of them already when we discussed niobium, Saudi Arabia, Quebec, Greenland, and Australia. An important sort of talk of the town these days are ionic adsorption clay deposits, which are formed by natural weathering of rare earth minerals, and their adsorption in ionic form into clay-rich saprolite. So an area which is less weathered than laterite. A lot of new projects around Brazil, in Minas Gerais, in Goiás, for example, also in Uganda, in central Chile, in Madagascar, but you find them also all around southern China. And finally, it's possible to find traces of rare earth material in those iron oxide copper gold deposit, IOCG deposits, and for example, Olympic Dam in South Australia, in Kiruna mine in northern Sweden, and possibly some others. So, what the question is, like, giving all of this, what does the US government do about all of that and our dependence on that broad geography with some of those locations not particularly friendly for us anymore? Well, essentially two things. One is stockpiling and the other one is investment. Stockpiling relies on the National Defense Stockpile, which contains about 50 different commodities stored at 9 locations within the continental US. And last year was determined that the stockpile's role is to cover 6% of total net shortfalls in scenarios of base case national emergency. But I find it kind of alarming because just imagine, a conventional attritional armed conflict, what happens then? And the ambition is to eliminate the dependence of the US on potentially vulnerable sources of supply not later than January 1, 2035, all right, 11 years from now. So I hope that whoever put this date there consulted the calendars of Mr. Xi Jinping and Mr. Putin on January 1st, 2035. But, recycling could help. It definitely helps in those minerals that have a military or say satellite loop like germanium or boron. It's less successful in other minerals, not least because of technology or storage issues. And so investment or support and investment is an important role, both for Department of Defense and Department of Energy. Department of Energy historically supported downstream and midstream projects, with one exception, the lithium boron project in Nevada, but it, as of recent, has also committed to support upstream projects in mining and exploration. DoD has done it for many years. Its main vehicle is Title III of Defense Production Act, whose role is to rebuild the supply chains and reduce our reliance on foreign manufacturing. It deploys between 10 million and 100 million, sometimes a little more, for different projects. And we've seen that in lithium, in cobalt, in rare earths, in titanium powder production, in nickel exploration, and in graphite in 2 projects in Alaska and Alabama. Now, what's missing in this approach? It's our view that actually grants and low-cost debt cannot really solve the problem of competitiveness because they're not ideally geared towards the needs of a sector which is so reliant on relatively illiquid public equity markets. And so viability of the Western junior mining space, which is really key to the redevelopment of these value chains in the West, hinges on the health of the Canadian and Australian equity markets. And frankly, in recent years, both have been failing in terms of capital formation for the sector. The result is that today the cost of capital for exploration and mineral development companies is simply too high, especially given high price volatility of many of these commodities, volatility which is partly at least caused by Chinese policies. Undersecretary Fernandez spoke about it last week in the context of cobalt. And for the purpose of US Defense Production Act, both Canada and Australia, and indeed the UK, are today included in the definition of domestic source. But if a strategic role of those relatively small Canadian and Australian listed companies to outcompete China, and China, meaning China state-supported players in the race for mineral deposits and for market share, then something needs to be done to reduce their cost of equity. Now, how could this be done? Well, obviously, something could be achieved by incentivizing U.S. private capital to move to these markets on an ongoing basis, rather than just offering, an occasional grant or occasional low-cost credit from the public purse. But that's just food for thought. This is just an illustration, again, how dependent we are on imports of these minerals. And if you look at the flags on the right, you see that there is a reason to be alarmed. All right, Scott, do we have any questions?
Thank you so much. We're going to turn over to Stuart to ask the first question, but we certainly would love audience questions, so please submit those and we'll ask those.
Yeah, please submit them in on the chat bar on the web browser. So considering the high permitting timelines in the US compared to countries like Australia and Canada, what specific policy changes could streamline the permitting process to enhance competitiveness?
Okay, my first thought is all of those countries are federal countries. So in permitting, you have to go through different layers, and too often this is done sequentially. There should be something, before we touch upon subsidiarity concept in any federation. I'm originally Swiss, so familiar with that. But there should be a system that allows to process everything in parallel. I think Canada is currently thinking about such a process that would probably shorten the timeline somehow. But that's in these jurisdictions. We know that somehow our Chinese competitors have different ways to approach this. A great example recently has been Zimbabwe, where production came completely out of nowhere in the last 2 or 3 years. But I don't know exactly what the key to that is.
Yeah, I think for the US would be streamlining the permitting to, have a federal permitting timeline and process, and because so many things get caught up in these minute counties, and there's so many hoops to go through. Whereas in other jurisdictions like Canada, Australia, it's primarily a federal permit and state permit. They work together, and geology doesn't really care about a border, so you might be able to permit a mine in Minnesota and then 20 kilometers away. Sorry, you might not be able to permit in Minnesota, and 20 kilometers away in Michigan, you can get something permitted, but it's still the same geology. It's just a borderline. So I think people need to forget about those borderlines internally and work on, a federal solution.
Yeah, so don't get me wrong. It's still critical to do a base study properly, right? Environmental base study, and so difficult to cut that period, whatever it is, 18 months or something, on some hard rock deposits. But it could apply to everything. All the other work could be actually advanced partly in parallel. And I think this sequential Gantt chart that you see often from companies is what really extends those timelines and makes the Western mining completely uncompetitive in the current environment.
How can investors identify the right projects within the critical minerals sector, especially considering all the geopolitical and market complexities?
Well, several layers here. I mean, geopolitics is an easy one. You probably know which countries you have to exclude, and then pay attention to the fence sitters. So fence-sitting countries are those that, since the war started in Ukraine, have figured out that there is a lot that they can kind of win from either side. And so it's always to the highest bidder until, we lose the bid. So maybe it's also good to look at, what exactly the policies are, with a difference in terms of federal policies and difference in terms of local policies. I mentioned somewhat critically before Brazilian federal approach. In the meantime, at the local level, in some of the Brazilian states, it's probably among the best jurisdictions to operate and develop mining projects. So that's one thing. In terms of subsoil capacity, unfortunately, it comes with experience. So you need to know a lot about analogs, geological analogs, or where are those that are similar, a little bit like what we presented today. Similarity, genesis, host rock, and especially many of these are polymetallic. Metallurgy can kill a lot of polymetallic deposits that look really nice as long as you drill them out. So having some handle on how easy it is to say leach those specific minerals for those that really matter to you, as the focus for the same deposit may change over time. So the same deposit might have been economic during the first Cold War for something, then it was uneconomic during the globalization, 3 decades of globalization. Then it might have been economic during the globalization again for something else, and now in the second Cold War is maybe for something else. So check if the inorganic chemistry, because it's mostly inorganic here, has advanced sufficiently to separate these things at a low cost. And with the skill set that we have, because, for example, in rare earths, the skill set for separation is very limited in the West. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why China has also constrained exports of technology for separation last year in one of those policies that are aimed at thwarting the redevelopment of critical minerals industry in the West.
Stuart, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think just having to screen companies outside of the US, because most of these, the way the sector has evolved the last 100 years, the funding sources for these mineral projects have been the Canadian and Australian and the London stock exchanges. So for US investors to access those can be tough, given probably 80% of the world's mineral projects are owned by public companies traded in Canada, Australia, or London.
Mentioning sort of local leads me to something I'm curious about, just as a American citizen myself, and then just as a global citizen, what is it that we can do when we sort of, these alarm bells go off after hearing a presentation like this, on a local level, on a micro scale and on a macro scale?
Micro scale, I'm not sure, because it is a global challenge. Macro scale, it will, we're already going in this direction. It's a strong cooperation between like-minded countries. So it's not that we chose it, but I think the war in Europe chose it for us, and the consolidation of the Eurasian alliance, which is anti-Western, anti-American, made things a little easier for us. There's a number of initiatives just discussed with someone this morning, some of them driven by Washington in terms of cooperation, mineral security partnership that brings OECD countries plus India, and also increasing the number of countries that are sources of minerals. That's helpful. I kind of return to my last comment before, is that for as long as the capital market is not interested in it and just public purse is the only source, this is still very small guns. And let's not forget, because of financial repression in China, the entire system of deployment of funds overseas by China is state controlled. And so it's not comparable, our public budget and the entire source of trapped Chinese savings that are then simply weaponized by state-owned enterprises, and say China's engineering construction company that comes with the mining companies to build infrastructure for, say, the DRC or Bolivia or whoever have you. That makes this space very difficult for us. But I think there are signs that there is a cooperation. Hopefully, it's not going to be too undermined by the electoral cycle in the United States. The US will not be able to pull it off by itself, not only because of permitting and geology, but also because we are facing here a significant challenge from the strategic rivals.
I think locally, there's a lot of benefits for having mining for local communities. And, one example comes to mind. I was in Brazil seeing a lithium mine owned by a New York and Toronto listed mining company. And, the community was really looked after there. They really wanted jobs. It was a really poor area. And the company created, just out of their own goodwill, an extra 1% royalty on all the mining sales. And so all the sales of lithium, and all that money was to be used to build infrastructure locally, schools, clean up. Like, no locals had clean water supply, so putting water filtration systems in. So a lot of good can come locally. And then I think another thing is people need to be conscious of where things come from. Food doesn't come from the supermarket. There's a few steps before that, and to get good quality products, a lot of cheap products are made using poor environmental standards, maybe poor labor standards. So, to get good quality products can cost more. So people, I think the Western world's been addicted to cheap manufactured products out of China. But if you want good quality, sustainably made products, whether that's a car, a phone, your food in a sandwich, you got to be conscious of where it comes from.
Great. Well, I think we're almost out of time. Any sort of final thoughts that you guys want to share?
Tomasz? Well, I think,
Stuart?
the government, particularly in, being an outsider in the US, people are becoming more aware of this. Media publications are talking about, lithium and what makes up products in your phone or your car. And the defense application side of things were very real. I think, in the US, streamlining of policy to permit these mines so that can support local jobs, the US not being reliant on other countries. And I think the governments need to support the way that these mineral projects are funded, which is the Canadian, Australian capital markets. So, we need to get more investors in the space who are supporting these equity markets, because that's what will get these mines up in production and funded. Pass over to you, Tomasz.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It is a joint effort. We find that there's been so much focus on the sort of downstream, midstream development, especially in energy space, that it's as if investors forgot that none of those gigafactories, none of those fuel cells, none of those technologies will function without mining. And so if we are to basically just incentivize Chinese mining around the world, not only is it strategically dangerous in the longer term, but it's also not traceable, not ESG compliant, non-transparent. So it's really a missing element of the entire reindustrialization story that we kind of kicking in this decade slowly. I understand it takes time, but I think the fact that the U.S. Capital market is not particularly geared towards mining, it's unhelpful and has this necessity to really work together with America's allies in Europe, in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Australia, Canada. That's inevitable. That's the way to protect our supply chains, and minerals and critical minerals are an integral part of those.
Well, I think that's a great ending point. Thank you both. So as we conclude today's webinar, I want to thank everyone for once again attending. The insights, I think, really underscore how critical minerals shape our technological and geopolitical advances landscapes. So thank you once again to our partners at Cohera, as well as everyone who tuned in. A replay will be available, and you can find the contact information for our fund, Tomasz and Stuart, here on your screen. You can also visit our website, amvestterraden.com, to learn more about our ongoing work. And so please reach out to learn more. And we thank you and farewell.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.